It was the kind of morning that gave no hint of the tragedy to come. The sun hung bright in a cloudless sky over Pine Creek, a town where most people felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. For Officer Ray Harmon, it was supposed to be just another shift. Respond to calls, write up reports, and make it home for dinner with his wife. Ray had been with the Pine Creek Police Department for 12 years. Most people in town knew him by his badge number, 437, which gleamed on his chest as he patrolled in his police cruiser. What they didn't know were the 18 complaints filed against him over those years. Complaints that vanished into file cabinets, dismissed as misunderstandings, or labeled unfounded by his fellow officers. Ray tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. A neighbor had called about suspicious activity at 1423 Maple Drive. The address was in Hillcrest, the nicer part of town where the lawns were always trimmed and the houses freshly painted. Ray smiled to himself. Calls from Hillcrest usually meant easy work. Someone worried about teenagers being too loud or a car they didn't recognize parked on their street. Copy that, Ray replied, turning his cruiser toward Hillcrest. Unit 437 responding. At 1423 Maple Drive, Eleanor Thomas was watering her roses. At 68, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained sharp as ever. After 30 years teaching history at Pine Creek High School, retirement had given her time for gardening and volunteering at the community center. Today she wore her favorite gardening hat, a wide-brimmed straw thing that her son Michael always teased her about. Michael. The thought of her son brought a smile to Eleanor's face. He'd made something of himself. A federal prosecutor who handled big cases in the city. Fighting for the little guy, as he put it. Eleanor couldn't be prouder, though she wished he'd visit more often. His work kept him busy, but they spoke on the phone every Sunday without fail. She didn't notice the police cruiser pulling up across the street or Officer Harmon watching her through his windshield for a long moment before he stepped out. "Ma'am," Ray called out, hand resting casually on his holster as he approached. "Need to have a word with you." Eleanor turned, surprised by the voice. Water dripped from her watering can onto her gardening shoes. "Officer, is everything all right?" she asked, squinting against the sun to see his face. "Got a call about suspicious activity at this address," Ray said, looking her up and down. Something about the way this woman stood bothered him. Too confident, maybe. Like she wasn't worried about him being there. "You live here?" Eleanor nodded, setting down her watering can. "Yes, for almost 40 years now. I'm Eleanor Thomas." "Can I see some ID?" Ray asked, taking another step forward. Eleanor frowned. "ID? I'm just watering my garden, officer." Ray's jaw tightened. He didn't like having to repeat himself. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification, standard procedure." "Well, my purse is inside," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the house. "This seems silly, but I can go get it if you insist." Ray watched her closely. In his mind, cooperative people didn't question police requests. Cooperative people said yes, sir, and did as they were told. "Just get your ID," he said, his voice hardening. Eleanor sighed and turned toward the house. She'd dealt with difficult people throughout her teaching career and knew when someone was on a power trip. Best to just show him her driver's license and get back to her roses. As she reached the front steps, she remembered her phone was in her pocket. Michael had always told her to record any interactions with police. Just in case, he'd said. Eleanor thought he was being paranoid, but he'd insisted it was just good sense these days. She reached into her pocket for the phone, turning slightly, back toward Officer Harmon. Ray saw her hand move to her pocket and felt a jolt of adrenaline. His training kicked in, or at least what he remembered of it. "Hand, show me your hand," he shouted, drawing his weapon in one fluid motion. Eleanor froze, confused by the sudden escalation. "What?" "I'm just getting my—" The first shot caught her in the chest. The second followed a split second later. Eleanor fell backward onto her own front steps, the phone tumbling from her fingers onto the manicured lawn. Ray stood with his gun still pointed, heart pounding in his ears. In that moment, he truly believed he'd seen a weapon. It was only when He kicked the phone away from Eleanor's motionless body. That reality began to sink in. Neighbors appeared on porches and in windows, drawn by the sound of gunshots. Someone was screaming. Someone else was recording everything on their phone. Ray holstered his weapon and called it in, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. Shots fired at 1423 Maple Drive. Suspect down. Send backup in an ambulance. But Ray knew an ambulance wouldn't help Eleanor Thomas. The stillness of her body told him everything. Her wide-brimmed gardening hat had fallen off, revealing gray hair splayed across the steps. The roses she'd been tending swayed gently in the breeze, oblivious to the fact that their caretaker would never water them again. Within minutes, the quiet street transformed. Police cars with flashing lights, yellow tape marking off the scene, neighbors giving statements, some tearful, some angry. "She was just a sweet old lady," one kept saying. "She taught my kids history." Lieutenant Frank Rivera arrived and pulled Ray aside. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes darting between Ray and the body now covered with a sheet. "She went for something in her pocket," Ray said, the words coming out automatically. "I thought it was a gun. I followed protocol." Frank looked at him for a long moment. In 12 years, Ray had never fired his weapon on duty. But there had been incidents, complaints about excessive force, about racial comments, about pulling people over without cause. Nothing that ever stuck, but enough to create a pattern that Frank had chosen to ignore. "The neighbor who called this in," Frank said quietly. "She reported a suspicious black man walking around the house. But Mrs. Thomas lived here. She wasn't suspicious. She wasn't a threat." Ray said nothing, staring at the sheet covering Eleanor's body. "And there's something else," Frank continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Her son just arrived. He was coming to surprise her for her birthday. He's a federal prosecutor, Ray. Civil Rights Division." As if on cue, a tall man in a suit pushed through the growing crowd, his face twisted in grief and rage. Two officers held him back as he shouted, "That's my mother, let me through." Michael Thomas had made a career of prosecuting corrupt officials and civil rights violations. He'd faced down hardened criminals and powerful politicians. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, seeing his mother's house surrounded by police tape, her body lying covered on the steps where she'd taught him to tie his shoes. The news crews arrived next, setting up cameras and asking questions. The story was already taking shape. A respected retired teacher, a federal prosecutor's mother, shot dead in her own yard by an officer with a history of complaints. Back at the station, Ray sat alone in a small room. His gun and badge had been taken. Standard procedure during an officer-involved shooting investigation, they told him. But the looks in their eyes said something else. For the first time in his career, Ray felt the weight of accountability settling on his shoulders. In the coming days, the body camera footage would tell the real story. Eleanor reaching for her phone, Ray's immediate escalation, the shots fired without real warning. There would be protests in the streets of Pine Creek. The FBI would open a civil rights investigation, and Michael Thomas would vow to see justice done for his mother, no matter how high up the chain of command the rot went. But for now, as the sun began to set on Pine Creek, two families were forever changed. Eleanor Thomas would never again tend her roses or call her son on Sunday, and Ray Harmon would never again wear the badge that had protected him for 12 years. A single moment of fear and power had erupted into violence, and nothing, not explanations, not excuses, not the "I feared for my life" that Ray would later claim, could bring back the woman in the gardening hat who had simply been watering her flowers on a beautiful spring day. The Pine Creek police station hummed with unusual tension. Officers spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting nervously whenever the door opened. It had been 3 days since Ray Harmon shot Eleanor Thomas, and the small-town police force found itself under a spotlight none of them had experienced before. In the chief's office, Police Chief William Porter stared at the computer screen, watching the body camera footage for what must have been the 20th time. Each viewing made his stomach sink further. There was no way around it. The footage showed an unjustified shooting, Eleanor Thomas had clearly been reaching for a phone, not a weapon, and Ray's command to show her hands had been followed almost immediately by gunfire, giving her virtually no time to comply. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Porter called, quickly closing the video file. Lieutenant Rivera entered, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "The FBI agents are here, Chief." Porter nodded grimly. When the victim was the mother of a federal prosecutor, things moved quickly. The Justice Department had announced a civil rights investigation within hours of the shooting. "Send them in," Porter said, straightening his uniform. 2 agents entered, a tall woman with short gray hair and a younger man whose serious expression matched his crisp suit. "Chief Porter, I'm Special Agent Diana Chen. This is Special Agent Trevor Wilson. We're leading the federal investigation into the death of Eleanor Thomas." Porter shook their hands, gesturing toward the chairs across from his desk. "I understand the gravity of this situation. My department is committed to full cooperation." Agent Chen didn't smile. "We'll need access to all of Officer Harmon's personnel. Files, including any past complaints or disciplinary actions." "Of course," Porter said, though inwardly he winced. Those files would reveal a pattern that didn't look good for Ray, or for the department's supervision of him. "We'll also need to interview every officer who's worked with Harmon in the past 5 years, Agent Wilson added, starting with Lieutenant Rivera. As the agents outlined their investigation plans, Porter felt a cold realization wash over him. This wasn't going to be contained to just Ray Harmon. The entire department's practices would be scrutinized. Across town, in a modest hotel room, Michael Thomas sat surrounded by papers. In the 3 days since his mother's death, grief had hardened into purpose. As a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases, he'd seen this scenario from the other side. Families devastated by police violence, seeking justice in a system that rarely delivered it. Now, he was that family. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his boss, U.S. Attorney Richard Patel. "Michael," Patel said when he answered. "How are you holding up?" Michael ran a hand over his face. "I'm working. It's all I can do right now." "That's actually why I'm calling," Patel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need to step back. Let the FBI handle this." "Richard, you know the rules, Michael. You can't be involved in a case where you have a personal connection, especially one this personal." Deep down, Michael knew his boss was right. His involvement could jeopardize the case against Ray Harmon, but stepping aside felt impossible. "The special prosecutor will be announced tomorrow," Patel continued. "Gloria Washington is taking the case." For the first time in days, Michael felt a spark of hope. Washington was known for her thoroughness and integrity. If anyone could navigate the complexities of prosecuting a police officer, it was her. "Good," he said simply. "She's good." After hanging up, Michael walked to the window looking out at the town where he'd grown up, where his mother had taught generations of children, the town that had taken her from him. His phone buzzed with a text from Danielle Cooper, a local reporter who'd been covering the case. "Community meeting tonight at First Baptist, 7 p.m. People want to hear from you." Michael hesitated. As a federal prosecutor, he typically avoided public statements about ongoing cases. But this wasn't just any case. And maybe the community needed to see the human cost of what had happened, not just a headline, but a son who'd lost his mother. That evening, the First Baptist Church overflowed with people. Black and white, young and old, they packed the pews and stood along the walls. The mayor was there, along with several town council members, community leaders, and what looked like half the town. Pastor Johnson introduced Michael, who walked slowly to the podium. The room fell silent. "My mother taught history at Pine Creek High for 30 years, Michael began, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "She believed in this town. She believed in justice and fairness. She believed people could be better than their worst impulses." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. 3 days ago, she was watering her roses. Now she's gone, because an officer sworn to protect her saw her as a threat instead of as a grandmother who loved gardening and reading and baking cookies for the neighborhood kids. A murmur went through the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked down. I've spent my career fighting for justice in courtrooms. But justice isn't just about what happens in court. It's about the systems that allow these tragedies to happen in the first place. For the next 10 minutes, Michael spoke about the need for police accountability, about the 18 complaints against Officer Harmon that had been dismissed or buried, about the culture that protected bad officers at the expense of public safety. When he finished, the silence hung heavy for a moment before Pastor Johnson returned to the podium. We're here tonight not just to mourn with Michael, but to commit ourselves to change, the pastor said. What happened to Eleanor Thomas cannot happen again in our town. One by one, community members stood to speak. A retired black police officer talked about the training improvements needed. A high school student who'd had Mrs. Thomas as a teacher wept as she described learning history from someone who made everyone feel valued. The owner of a local restaurant announced he was starting a scholarship in Eleanor's name. As Michael listened, something unexpected began to take root alongside his grief. Hope that his mother's death might lead to meaningful change. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Ray Harmon sat alone, staring at the television news coverage of the community meeting. The department had placed him on administrative leave pending the investigation, but Ray knew his career was likely over. The body camera footage was damning, and the public outcry was growing louder by the day. His union representative had called earlier, explaining that they would provide legal counsel, but warning that the evidence looked bad. There might be criminal charges, the rep had said, not just departmental discipline. Ray turned off the TV and walked to his kitchen, where an unopened bottle of whiskey sat on the counter. He'd been sober for 3 years, but tonight the temptation felt overwhelming. His phone rang, his wife calling from her sister's house where she'd gone, just until things settled down. Ray let it go to voicemail. How had it come to this? In his mind, he'd been a good cop. Sure, maybe he'd cut some corners, been a little rough with people who deserved it, but he'd never intended to kill an innocent grandmother. The next morning, the investigation intensified. FBI agents interviewed Ray's fellow officers, pulled records, and reviewed years of incident reports. They found a disturbing pattern. Ray had used force predominantly against people of color, had a history of escalating routine encounters, and had been protected by supervisors who dismissed complaints. At the county courthouse, Special Prosecutor Gloria Washington met with the EI district attorney to discuss potential charges. The body camera footage is clear, Washington said. This wasn't a split-second decision in a life-threatening situation. This was, at minimum, criminal negligence resulting in death. The district attorney nodded. The grand jury convenes next. Week. I think they'll indict. They'd better, Washington replied. The evidence is overwhelming. As they discussed legal strategy, protests continued to grow outside the police station. What had started as a small group of local activists had swelled to hundreds of people carrying signs with Eleanor's face and chanting demands for justice. National news vans lined the streets of Pine Creek, their satellite dishes beaming images of the small town's turmoil across the country. Eleanor Thomas had become a symbol of police violence, her story resonating far beyond the boundaries of the town where she'd spent her life. Back at his hotel, Michael prepared for his mother's funeral. He'd chosen her favorite hymns and asked her former students to share memories. In the midst of the investigation and growing movement, he needed this moment to simply be a son saying goodbye to his mother. As he straightened his tie, his phone rang. Agent Chen from the FBI. Mr. Thomas, she said, her voice solemn. I wanted you to hear this from me first. We've finished reviewing Officer Harmon's history and the department records. This case goes beyond one officer. We're expanding our investigation to include departmental practices and supervision. There's evidence of a pattern that enabled this tragedy. Michael closed his eyes. It was what he'd suspected. His mother's death wasn't just about Ray Harmon's actions that day, but about a system that had failed to address warning signs for years. Thank you for telling me, he said. As he hung up, Michael knew that the fight for justice was just beginning. The investigation, the potential trial, the push for reform, all of it lay ahead. But first, he had to bury his mother. The county courthouse stood tall against the clear blue sky, its stone steps crowded with reporters and camera crews. 6 weeks had passed since Eleanor Thomas was killed in her front yard, and today the grand jury would announce whether Officer Ray Harmon would face criminal charges. Inside, Michael Thomas sat in the back row of the courtroom, hands clasped tightly in his lap. As a prosecutor, he'd been in countless courtrooms, but never like this. Never as the victim's family, waiting for justice for someone he loved. His colleague and friend, David Chen, sat beside him. "Whatever happens today," David whispered, "remember this is just the beginning of the process." Michael nodded. He knew the statistics better than most. How rarely police officers were indicted for on-duty shootings, how even more rarely they were convicted. But the evidence in his mother's case was overwhelming. The body camera footage, the phone in her hand, not a weapon, the 18 ignored complaints against Harmon. Surely that would be enough. At the front of the courtroom, District Attorney Patricia Wells stood as the judge entered. The room fell silent. "The grand jury has reached a decision in the matter of the state versus Raymond Harmon," the judge announced, accepting a folded paper from the clerk. He read it silently first, his expression giving nothing away. Michael held his breath. The grand jury returns an indictment on the charge of second-degree murder. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by murmurs that grew louder until the judge called for order. Michael closed his eyes briefly. The first hurdle cleared. Across town, Ray Harmon received the news in his lawyer's office. The indictment wasn't unexpected. His lawyer had been preparing him for this possibility. But hearing it confirmed still hit him hard. "What happens now?" Ray asked, his voice hollow. "Arraignment is next," his lawyer explained. "You'll enter a plea. We'll request bail. And then trial?" Ray's hand shook slightly. "Eventually, yes, but that could be months away. The prosecution has to share their evidence with us first. Discovery. We'll have time to build our defense." Ray nodded mechanically. His life had unraveled since the shooting. His wife had filed for separation. Former friends and colleagues avoided him. The police union still provided his legal representation, but many officers had distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with what was becoming a landmark case of police accountability. "What are my chances?" Ray finally asked. His lawyer, John Miller, hesitated. "The video is problematic," he admitted, "but we can argue about split-second decisions, about the training you received, about department practices that may have contributed to your actions that day." In other words, Ray thought, throw everyone else under the bus to save myself. As spring turned to summer, Pine Creek remained in the national spotlight. The case had sparked wider conversations about police training, oversight, and accountability. Local activists had formed a coalition calling for reform, and the town council was considering establishing a civilian review board for police conduct. At the FBI field office, Agents Chen and Wilson continued their broader investigation into the Pine Creek Police Department. They had interviewed dozens of officers and reviewed thousands of pages of documents, building a case that went far beyond Ray Harmon. "It's a pattern of deliberate indifference," Agent Chen explained to her supervisor. "Complaints buried. Warning. Signs ignored. Problematic officers protected rather than disciplined or retrained." "Do you have enough for civil rights charges against the department leadership?" her supervisor asked. "Getting there," Chen replied. Chief Porter claims he delegated complaint review to Lieutenant Rivera, who in turn claims he was following established department practices. They're all pointing fingers at each other. "And meanwhile, an innocent woman is dead," the supervisor said grimly. July brought Ray Harmon's pre-trial hearing. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters on both sides, those demanding justice for Eleanor Thomas and a smaller group supporting Ray, mostly fellow officers and their families from neighboring departments. Inside the courtroom, Special Prosecutor Gloria Washington laid out the state's case methodically. "The evidence will show that Officer Harmon used deadly force against Mrs. Thomas without justification," Washington told the judge. "The body camera footage clearly shows Mrs. Thomas reaching for her phone, not a weapon, when Officer Harmon shot her. Furthermore, He gave her less than 2 seconds to comply with his command before firing. This was not a reasonable use of force under any standard. Defense attorney Miller countered with arguments about the dangers police officers face daily and the split-second decisions they must make. Officer Harmon responded based on his training and his perception of a potential threat. Miller insisted. This was a tragic mistake, not a crime. The judge set a trial date for September and denied the defense's motion to dismiss the charges. Ray would remain free on bail, but with restrictions. He couldn't leave the county, couldn't contact any potential witnesses, and couldn't possess firearms. As summer heat baked the streets of Pine Creek, Michael Thomas found himself caught between his personal grief and the public nature of his mother's case. Reporters sought him out for interviews. Activists asked him to speak at rallies, and every time he visited his mother's grave, he half expected to find camera crews waiting. One evening, as Michael sat on his hotel balcony watching the sunset, his phone rang. It was Gloria Washington. "Michael," she said without preamble, "the defense has made an offer." Michael sat up straighter. "What kind of offer?" Harmon would plead guilty to manslaughter. 10 years, eligible for parole in 5. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "That's not enough." "I understand how you feel," Washington said carefully, "but trials are unpredictable. One holdout, juror, and we could end up with a hung jury or even an acquittal." "My mother was shot in her own yard for reaching for her phone," Michael said, his voice steady despite the anger churning inside him. "That's not manslaughter, that's murder." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll reject the offer," Washington finally said. "But I wanted you to know about it." After hanging up, Michael stared out at the darkening sky. As a prosecutor, he'd advised victims' families to accept plea deals many times, explaining the risks of trial, the benefits of certainty. But now, sitting on the other side, he understood why so many had rejected his practical advice. Some things demanded full justice, not compromise. Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the other side of town, Ray Harmon sat alone with a stack of papers. The prosecution's evidence against him shared during discovery. Photographs of Eleanor Thomas's body, transcripts of witness statements, analysis of the body camera footage, broken down second by second, and most damning of all, the history of complaints against him that showed a clear pattern of escalation and bias. Ray pushed the papers away and put his head in his hands. For the first time, he was truly seeing himself through others' eyes, not as the hero he'd imagined himself to be, but as someone whose actions had caused irreparable harm. His lawyer had explained the plea offer and the prosecution's rejection. "We need to prepare for trial," Miller had said. "The jury selection will be crucial. We need people who respect law enforcement, who understand the pressures officers face." But as Ray sat alone with the evidence, he wondered if anyone could look at what he'd done and find it justified. The trial date approached rapidly. In late August, Pine Creek filled with national media preparing to cover what had become one of the most high-profile police shooting cases in years. Hotel rooms were booked solid. Satellite trucks lined the streets near the courthouse. Businesses downtown put up signs either supporting justice for Eleanor or standing with Officer Harmon. The town physically divided by where people stood on the case. At the FBI offices, Agents Chen and Wilson prepared to announce the results of their broader investigation into the Pine Creek Police Department. They had found evidence of systematic failures in training, supervision, and accountability, failures that had created the conditions for Eleanor Thomas's death. "We'll announce the findings the week after Harmon's trial begins," Agent Chen decided. "We don't want to influence the jury pool." The night before the trial, Michael Thomas visited his mother's grave. Someone had placed fresh flowers there, roses, her favorite. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember her not as a victim or a symbol, but simply as his mom, the woman who had checked his homework, who had cheered at his law school graduation, who had called him every Sunday just to chat. "We're getting there, Mom," he said quietly. "Tomorrow it begins." Across town, Ray Harmon knelt in prayer at his bedside, something he hadn't done since he was a child. The weight of what was coming, and what he had done, pressed down on him like a physical thing. The next morning dawned bright and clear. By 7 a.m., crowds had already gathered outside the courthouse: protesters, supporters, media, and curious onlookers. Police barricades kept them separated, officers from the county sheriff's department maintaining order since the Pine Creek police were too closely connected to the case. At 8:30 a.m., the doors to the courthouse opened. The trial that would decide Ray Harmon's fate, and perhaps signal a turning point in police accountability, was about to begin. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff called out, "All rise, court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Anthony Wilson presiding. Judge I." Wilson, a man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, took his seat and surveyed the packed room. On one side sat Michael Thomas, flanked by family members who had come from across the country to support him. On the other side, Ray Harmon sat beside his attorney, his posture stiff, his face a carefully controlled mask. "Be seated," the judge said. "We're here for the trial of State versus Raymond Harmon. Are both sides ready to proceed?" Special Prosecutor Gloria Washington stood. "The State is ready, Your Honor." Defense Attorney John Miller rose next. "Defense is ready, Your Honor." Judge Wilson nodded. "Very well. Ms. Washington, you may give your opening statement." Gloria Washington moved to stand before the jury, 12 citizens of the county, carefully selected after days of questioning about their views on law enforcement, racial bias, and use of force. The jury reflected the diversity of the county: 7 women, 5 men, different ages and backgrounds, all watching her intently. Eleanor Thomas was 68 years old. Washington began, her voice clear and strong. She was a retired teacher, a mother, a community volunteer. On April 15th of this year, she was watering the roses in her front yard when Officer Raymond Harmon drove up. Less than 2 minutes later, she lay dying on her own front steps, shot twice by Officer Harmon. Washington walked slowly in front of the jury box. The evidence in this case is clear and undeniable. Body camera footage shows exactly what happened that day. Mrs. Thomas was reaching for her phone, not a weapon, when Officer Harmon shot her. He gave her less than 2 seconds to respond to his command before firing. This was not a reasonable use of force. This was not a split-second decision in the face of real danger. This was, ladies and gentlemen, second-degree murder. Washington returned to her table and John Miller rose for the defense's opening. "Police officers make life or death decisions in fractions of seconds," Miller began. "They don't have the luxury of hindsight or slow-motion replay. In that moment, Officer Harmon believed Mrs. Thomas was reaching for a weapon. He acted based on his training and his perception of a threat." Miller gestured toward Ray, who sat with his head slightly bowed. "Was this a tragic mistake?" "Yes, absolutely. Officer Harmon has never denied that. But a mistake is not a crime. A mistake made in the line of duty, while performing the dangerous job we ask our police officers to do, is not murder." As the opening statements concluded, Michael Thomas found himself studying Ray Harmon's face. This was the first time he'd been this close to the man who killed his mother. Harmon looked smaller than Michael had imagined, more ordinary. Not a monster, just a man. And somehow that made it worse. The trial proceeded with the prosecution calling their first witness, the medical examiner who had performed Eleanor's autopsy. Dr. Laura Phillips spoke with clinical precision about the bullet wounds, the cause of death, the angle of the shots. Photos were displayed on a large screen, clinical, terrible images that made Michael close his eyes briefly. "In your expert opinion," Washington asked, "could Mrs. Thomas have survived these injuries even with immediate medical attention?" "No," Dr. Phillips replied. "The damage to her heart and lungs was catastrophic. Death would have occurred within minutes." The defense asked few questions of the medical examiner. The cause of death wasn't in dispute. Next, Washington called the neighbor who had witnessed the shooting from her kitchen window. "I was washing dishes," said Helen Cooper, a woman in her 50s with glasses and a nervous manner. "I saw Mrs. Thomas watering her roses like she did every morning. Then the police car pulled up." "And what did you see next?" Washington prompted. The officer got out and started talking to her. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Mrs. Thomas put down her watering can and turned toward her house. Then she reached into her pocket and the officer started shouting. It happened so fast he pulled his gun and shot her before she could even respond. Did Mrs. Thomas make any threatening movements toward the officer? No, Helen said firmly. She was just standing there reaching into her pocket. Then she was on the ground. During cross-examination, Miller tried to suggest that from her angle, Helen might not have seen everything clearly, but she remained certain of what she'd witnessed. I've lived across from Eleanor for 15 years, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I saw what happened. The most damning testimony came when the prosecution played the body camera footage in full. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as the final moments of Eleanor Thomas's life played out on screen. Her confusion at the officer's demands, her hand moving to her pocket, Harmon's shout, the gunshots, the phone falling from her hand onto the grass. Several jurors visibly flinched at the sound of the shots. One older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. After the footage, Washington called FBI agent Diana Chen to testify about the broader pattern of behavior they'd uncovered in their investigation. Officer Harmon had 18 formal complaints filed against him during his 12 years with the Pine Creek Police Department. Agent Chen testified. 14 of those complaints came from people of color. All were dismissed without substantial investigation. And in your analysis of Officer Harmon's record, did you find evidence of escalation in his use of force? Washington asked. Yes. There was a clear pattern of Officer Harmon escalating routine encounters, particularly with minority citizens. The department's own records show that he used force at a rate 4 times higher than other officers with similar patrol assignments. As Agent Chen continued, Michael noticed Ray Harmon's shoulders hunching further, his attorney whispering to him occasionally. For the first time, Michael wondered if Ray truly understood the pattern his actions had formed, if he'd ever stopped to consider what the complaints against him actually meant. The prosecution rested their case after 3 days of testimony. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The video, the witness accounts, the pattern of behavior. The experts who testified that Ray's use of force violated both department policy and reasonable standards. Then, it was the defense's turn. John Miller began by calling police training experts who testified about the split-second decisions officers must make and the concept of perceived threats. He called fellow officers who spoke about the dangers of the job and Ray's dedication to it. Finally, on the 5th day of trial, Ray Harmon himself took the stand. The courtroom tensed as he was sworn in, all eyes fixed on the man at the center of the case. Officer Harmon, Miller began, please tell the court about your training regarding potential threats and weapon identification. Ray cleared his throat. We're trained that any reaching movement could indicate a subject is going for a weapon, especially reaching into pockets or waistbands. We're taught that hesitation could cost us our lives. And on April 15th, what did you perceive when Mrs. Thomas reached into her pocket? I perceived a potential threat, Ray said, his voice steady but quiet. Based on my training and experience, I believed she might be reaching for a weapon. Did you intend to kill Mrs. Thomas when you responded to that call? No, sir, Ray said. I was responding to a suspicious person call. I had no intention of using force at all when I arrived. When it was Gloria Washington's turn to cross-examine, she approached Ray slowly, deliberately. Officer Harmon, you testified that you perceived a threat when Mrs. Thomas reached into her pocket. But the call you were responding to was simply about suspicious activity, correct? Yes, ma'am. And when you arrived, what you found was an elderly woman watering flowers in her own yard, correct? Yes, but I didn't know it was her yard at the time. Washington nodded. Let's talk about those 18 complaints against you. Were you aware that 14 of them came from people of color? Miller objected, and after a brief sidebar, the judge allowed the question. I didn't keep track of that, Ray answered. Were you aware that you used force 4 times more often than your fellow officers? No, I wasn't aware of that statistic. Washington picked up a document from her table. In 2020, you pepper sprayed a teenager for what you described as non-compliance when he didn't immediately show ID. That complaint was dismissed. In 2021, you broke a man's wrist while handcuffing him during a routine traffic stop. That complaint was dismissed. In 2022, objection, Miller called. Counsel is testifying, not asking questions. Sustained, the judge ruled. Ms. Washington, please ask a question. Washington looked directly at Ray. Officer Harmon, given this pattern of complaints, do you believe you might have had a problem with excessive force before the day you shot Eleanor Thomas? Ray stared at her for a long moment. The courtroom was completely silent, waiting for his answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Looking back now, yes, I think maybe I did. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Michael Thomas leaned forward slightly, surprised by the admission. No further questions, Washington said. As Ray stepped down from the witness stand, his shoulders slumped. Something had changed in his face, a realization perhaps of the full weight of his actions not just on that April day, but throughout his career. The next morning, both sides presented their closing arguments. Washington emphasized the clear evidence of unreasonable force and the pattern of behavior that led to it. Miller stressed the split-second nature of police decisions and urged the jury to consider Ray's state of mind, not just the tragic outcome. At 2:17 p.m., the jury was sent to deliberate. Michael Thomas waited in a small conference room with his family, alternating between pacing and sitting with his head in his hands. Ray Harmon waited in another room with his attorney and his brother, the only family member who had stood by him. Hours passed. The courthouse remained open as evening approached, the crowd outside growing rather than diminishing as word spread that a verdict might come. At 8:43 p.m., the jury sent word that they had reached a decision. The courtroom filled. Quickly, tension thick in the air. Judge Wilson took his seat. I understand the jury has reached a verdict? The jury forewoman, a middle-aged black woman with kind eyes and a firm expression, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the second degree, how do you find? The forewoman's voice rang clear in the silent room. We find the defendant, Raymond Harmon, guilty. 2 weeks after the verdict, the Pine Creek courthouse was once again filled to capacity. This time, people gathered for Ray Harmon's sentencing. The case that had captivated the nation was reaching its conclusion, but for those most deeply affected, the journey was far from over. Michael Thomas sat in the front row, the same seat he had occupied throughout the trial. Beside him was his Aunt Linda, his mother's sister, who had flown in from Arizona. Their hands were clasped tightly together as they waited for the proceedings to begin. On the other side of the aisle, Ray Harmon's brother sat alone. Ray's wife had filed for divorce shortly after the guilty verdict, unable to reconcile herself to a future waiting for a husband behind bars. Judge Wilson entered the courtroom, his robes rustling as he took his seat. His face betrayed nothing of what he might be thinking as he surveyed the room, gaze settling on Ray Harmon, who stood with his attorney. This court is now in session for the sentencing of Raymond Harmon, the judge announced. Before I pronounce sentence, both sides may make their statements. Ms. Washington. Gloria Washington rose. Your Honor, the state recommends the maximum sentence allowed by law. Raymond Harmon abused the trust and authority given to him as a police officer. His actions took the life of Eleanor Thomas, a respected member of our community who posed no threat. Furthermore, the pattern of behavior that led to this tragedy, the history of excessive force complaints, the escalation of routine encounters, shows a disregard for the rights and safety of the citizens he was sworn to protect. She turned slightly, acknowledging Michael with a small nod. No sentence can bring Mrs. Thomas back to her family and community, but justice demands meaningful consequences for this crime. Judge Wilson nodded. Mr. Miller, defense attorney John Miller, stood next to his client. Your Honor, we ask the court to consider several mitigating factors. Mr. Harmon has no prior criminal record. His service as an officer, while not without incident, included many positive contributions to this community. He has expressed genuine remorse for Mrs. Thomas's death. We ask for a sentence that acknowledges the seriousness of this tragedy while allowing for the possibility of rehabilitation and redemption. Mr. Harmon, the judge said, You have the right to address the court before sentencing. Do you wish to do so? Ray nodded and stepped forward. The man who stood at the podium looked different from the officer who had shot Eleanor Thomas 6 months earlier. His face was thinner, lined with stress. His eyes, once confident to the point of arrogance, now held a haunted look. Your Honor, Ray began, his voice rough. I've thought about what to say here for days. Nothing seems adequate. He paused, taking a deep breath. I took a life I had no right to take. Mrs. Thomas was doing nothing wrong. She was just living her life, in her yard, and I ended that life because of assumptions and fear and training that taught me to see threats everywhere. Ray's hands gripped the podium. During the trial, I heard about all those complaints against me, all those times I used force when I didn't need to. I never saw the pattern until it was laid out like that. I never wanted to see it. He turned slightly, looking directly at Michael Thomas. I can't undo what I did. I can't bring your mother back. All I can say is that I'm sorry, truly sorry, and I accept whatever sentence the court gives me. The courtroom remained silent as Ray returned to stand beside his attorney. Judge Wilson studied some papers before him, then looked up. Raymond Harmon, you have been found guilty of second-degree murder. This court sentences you to 25 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after serving 15 years. Ray's shoulders slumped slightly, but he showed no other reaction. His brother put his head in his hands. Beyond this criminal sentence, the judge continued, the court notes that your conviction will ensure you can never again serve as a law enforcement officer. Your case will also be included in the National Database of Police Misconduct. The judge paused, looking around the courtroom. This case has revealed not just the actions of one officer, but failures in training, supervision, and accountability. The court hopes these systemic issues will be addressed so that such a tragedy does not happen again. With the bang of his gavel, it was over. Ray Harmon was led away in handcuffs, no longer an officer of the law, but a convicted criminal beginning a decades-long sentence. Outside the courthouse, Michael Thomas faced a crowd of reporters. The sentence is appropriate, he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. But this case was never just about punishing one person. It's about changing the systems that allowed this to happen. Later that evening, Michael sat alone in his hotel room, feeling the strange emptiness that comes when a long struggle ends. Justice had been served, at least in legal terms, but his mother was still gone. His phone rang. Agent Diana Chen from the FBI. Mr. Thomas, we're announcing the results of our broader investigation tomorrow, she said. I wanted you to know ahead of time. We've found significant civil rights violations in the Pine Creek Police Department's practices. The Justice Department will be mandating extensive reforms, including new use of force policies, better complaint tracking, and independent oversight. Thank you, Michael said. That matters. That really matters. Your mother's case made this possible, Agent Chen added. People paid attention because of what happened to her. After hanging up, Michael opened his laptop and looked at the email he'd been drafting. It was his resignation from the prosecutor's office. In the months since his mother's death, something had shifted in him. He no longer wanted to prosecute cases within the system. He wanted to change the system itself. The email outlined his plans to establish the Eleanor Thomas Foundation for Police Accountability and Reform. He had already secured funding commitments from several major donors who had been moved by his mother's story. The foundation would advocate for policy changes, provide training for police departments willing to reform, and offer legal support to victims of police misconduct. Michael finished the email and hit send. It felt like the first step on a new path, one that might help prevent other families from experiencing what his had endured. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Michael stood at a podium in Pine Creek's Central Park. Behind him, a small crowd had gathered for the unveiling of a memorial bench dedicated to his mother. The bench faced a new community garden planted where Eleanor had once taught neighborhood children about growing vegetables. My mother believed in this community, Michael told the gathered crowd. She believed in justice and in people's capacity to learn and change. The Eleanor Thomas Foundation carries forward that belief. He gestured toward the newly established garden. This space will be maintained by volunteers, including—" he paused, still finding it somewhat surreal, "including former officers from the Pine Creek Police Department who have committed to being part of the change we need." Among those officers was Lieutenant Frank Rivera, who had once ignored the warning signs about Ray Harmon. After the trial and the FBI investigation, Rivera had taken early retirement from the force. His first act as a civilian had been to volunteer with the foundation, determined to help reform the profession he still believed in despite its flaws. As Michael finished speaking and unveiled the simple bench with its plaque honoring Eleanor, he noticed a woman standing at the edge of the crowd, Helen Cooper, the neighbor who had witnessed his mother's shooting and testified at the trial. Helen approached him after the ceremony. "She would have loved this," she said, gesturing to the garden where children were already planting fall flowers, especially the kids being involved. "I think so too," Michael said. "I'm moving back into my house next week," Helen added. "I've been staying with my daughter since it happened. But it's time to come home." Michael nodded, understanding the significance of her decision. Life was continuing, even in the place where tragedy had struck. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Michael visited his mother's grave one last time before returning to the city. He had accepted a position with a national civil rights organization, where he would work on police reform legislation at the federal level. "It's happening, Mom," he said quietly, placing fresh roses on her grave. "Change is coming. Slowly maybe, but it's coming." He stood in silence for a moment, feeling the cool autumn breeze against his face. Then he walked back to his car, ready to continue the work that had become his purpose, ensuring that what happened to Eleanor Thomas would lead to lasting change. Across the state, Ray Harmon sat in his prison cell, writing in the journal his counselor had suggested he keep. His words traced his journey from defensive denial to genuine remorse, and his struggle to make whatever amends were possible from behind bars. He had begun corresponding with a restorative justice program, hoping that someday, years from now, he might find a way to contribute positively to the reforms sparked by his actions. The story of Eleanor Thomas and Ray Harmon had no neat ending. Justice,